The Vietnam War and how it affected both soldiers and their families. After French troops were removed from Vietnam while northern and southern Vietnam were separated, there was a threat of communism spreading to the country and the rest of Southeast Asia, becoming bigger than what the United States could handle. America's involvement in stopping the spread of communism was fueled by the idea of modernization and the spread of democracy. When America intervened, the Vietnam War began in 1955, continuing until 1975. The United States was at a severe disadvantage, for the terrain in Vietnam was different due to the wet and dry seasons, dense forests, and marshes. Also, because both countries engaged in guerrilla warfare, there were a mass amount of casualties and wounded soldiers. This left the surviving soldiers to come home traumatized with PTSD or post traumatic stress disorder. Because of these disadvantages and negative factors that connected to the war, many Americans disagreed with it and were given the name Doves. This started the counterculture movement, in which many Doves fought for peace and freedom around the country. Although the U.S. had many valid reasons for entering the Vietnam War, the violence and death within the war negatively affected military families, causing many Americans to refute the war. Here to speak about his duties during the Vietnam War is my grandfather, Thomas Pasek.
Okay, well, I was in the Air Force, and I was in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969. Okay, about December time frame. Okay.
Yeah.
While I was there, I was stationed at a small air base called Phu Cat Air Base. Phu Cat was rather unique because it had a small squadron of F-100 fighters,
Yeah.
and it was protected by the Korean Army. So we had a very secure base. My specific mission in Vietnam was a munitions loading officer. I took care of the storage in the area where we stored the weapons, okay, and I made sure that we received the weapons and stored them properly, but most important that I got them to the flight line. My crew got them to the flight line, and I made sure that the planes were loaded properly with the munitions slated for the sortie. And by the way, I was a captain in the Air Force.
There were many jobs involved in the Vietnam War. My grandfather's, in particular, demonstrated the amount of weaponry involved in it. The ammunition that he loaded onto planes was extremely deadly and meant to kill a large amount of people. The Vietnamese used similar tactics, which explain the large amount of casualties that drove Americans to hate the war.
Okay, the morale of my particular squadron, okay, was very positive. Okay, we had a very good outlook on our mission, which was to store the weapons and get the weapons to the airplanes. Okay, as for the sense of righteousness of the war, I heard virtually no comments against the war while I was there. We were there on a job. We were working for the government. We had a mission, and that was our job. We weren't a typical Vietnam fighting squadron. Well, we weren't fighting, okay? We were supporting, okay? And that made all the difference in the world, okay? I can honestly say that I was not aware, when I was at Phu Cat, I was not aware of the bombings in Cambodia. It very well could have been that some of the planes that I delivered munitions to dropped their ordnance in Cambodia, but it wasn't, we didn't know their targets, okay? Our job was to get the weapons to the plane, and that's what we did.
Luckily, my grandfather was not in the front lines during the Vietnam War, which may attribute to the overall positive morale of his squadron. The U.S. government did not only hide the bombings in Cambodia from the American citizens, but also many people working for the war, including my grandfather. Finding out about the bombings after returning home left many soldiers feeling guilty and depressed about their involvement in the war.
I am proud to say that during my tenure at Phuket, I was awarded a Bronze Star. Um, uh, it was for meritorious service and all the duties that I had as an officer in the squadron. I wasn't just a storage officer, a weapons officer. I had many administrative duties that I was responsible for. As I told you, the Koreans kept us very safe during my 12 months in Vietnam. When the day came where I could go home, obviously I was very excited. I was expected to get on a flight out of the air base at night, sometime, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, okay? So in the early afternoon, I walked into my commander's office to say goodbye, and the commander said, "Do you want to go home now?" And I said, obviously you knew the answer. Yeah, yes. He said, "Well, there's a C-130 out there that'll take you to Da Nang, and Da Nang you'll catch a big plane and go over across the pond." So I grabbed my bag, only one bag, and jumped on the plane, and I didn't have time to say goodbye to anybody. You know, it was that quick. So months went by. I got home, everything's fine. My 2 sons were fine, my wife was fine, my family was fine. Well, a couple of months went by, and I was in England, and I ran across one of my sergeants that was under my command. And the first thing he said is, "Captain Pasek, where were you? How come you weren't there to get your flight?" And I told him what happened. And then he told me what happened. He said they were on a truck going from the barracks to the flight line, and the Viet Cong hit our base real hard. Okay? The truck that was carrying a lot of my NCOs was hit. Several of my people were wounded. The munition storage area was hit, but not too badly. The building that I would have been in waiting for my flight to go, that was called the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Shack. They took care of disarming bombs that were dropped accidentally or didn't go off. That took several rocket rounds, direct hits, and Lord knows what would have happened if I was there. So I was pretty proud that I got home early.
Yeah. As seen through the attacks on Phu Cat Air Base, the violence in the Vietnam War left American soldiers traumatized and upset. My grandfather was extremely lucky to be home and safe before the attacks. However, many other soldiers were far less fortunate throughout the war. Now here to speak with us is my grandmother, Barbara Pasek, who will talk about how the Vietnam War affected her life and her family's life in America.
Well, when I first heard about him going to war, that was really difficult for me in a lot of ways, because I guess we were in the military and I knew it could happen, but when it really happened, it was different. And as far as did I agree with the war? No, I really didn't. I didn't like the war, but as a military officer's wife, I couldn't say anything about that. So it was very hard for me inside, but I had to show that I was okay with everything, and I certainly had to support my husband who was going over there. Well, it totally disrupted the life that we had. We had a small baby, a year old. We lived in Wichita, Kansas at the time that we found out about this. And and like I told you, I had just found out that I was pregnant with our second child. And we decided that I wasn't going to stay there. So we decided that I was going to go back to Massachusetts and stay with my mom in Gardner, Massachusetts, where I lived growing up. Well, because we decided to go back to Massachusetts with your dad, who was a year old, and then had a baby. Because I wasn't on a military base, I didn't really have as many obligations as a military wife.
The Vietnam War turned my grandparents' family upside down when my grandfather was called to Vietnam. Fortunately, my grandmother was able to take her son to live with her mom, where her family could help her out. However, many poor women were left at home with numerous children and no one to turn to. Because many people opposed the war, these women were considered to be suffering for no justifiable cause. Both my grandmother and grandfather have depicted the hardships that the Vietnam War brought upon both the soldiers and their families. Because of the secrecy and controversy over the cause of the war, the American people did not see a point in sending their loved ones off to Vietnam. The soldiers that returned suffered tremendously, for they were scarred by the violent war tactics displayed in the war. Though the Vietnam War was not a world war, it will never be forgotten, for it affected millions of Americans' lives.